Hello and welcome to this episode of the Art and Design of Sci-Fi and Fantasy, Mystery and Horror. Today I speak with author Dr. Marc DiPaolo, who's written about climate fiction in many different pop culture pieces, stuff in literature and in movies. We talk a lot about Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and Narnia. Mad Max comes up. We talk about Game of Thrones, a little bit about terraforming and sci-fi. We talk, and actually, Handmaid's Tale, religious aspects of climate fiction and environmental protection. So we talk about a lot of interesting, deep issues as they are found in your favorite pop culture pieces. I'm sure we're going to mention something that you like. Yeah, so thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Dr. Marc DiPaolo, author of Fire and Snow, Climate Fiction from the Inklings to Game of Thrones. Thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject of the book?
I have always been a genre fan growing up. You know, I grew up with like the Hammer horror films and comic books, and I really liked ElfQuest and The Hobbit when I was a kid. But I wasn't good at reading all the fantasy book series because books were so long, there were so many of them, and I kept hearing things like, the series goes downhill after book 3, or the author died and his replacement is no good, you know. So I stayed away from it. And I had a long commute to work a couple of years ago, and I decided to do some books on tape. And a friend said, you know, Song of Ice and Fire is literary crack, and it's the complete, uncensored, book with a good reader. So I listened to it and paid attention and enjoyed it, and it made the commute go by. And I said, I never did Narnia, so I did all those audiobooks. And I was sort of amazed. It felt to me like Game of Thrones was rated R Narnia, which I was sort of surprised by. The winter is coming and we need the thaw, and, they're just little thematic things. And then I tried to do some Tolkien I'd never read before, like Silmarillion. And everything I was just picking casually, or I was in the mood for it, wound up seeming to me to be this stealth environmentalist text. And I was particularly surprised by it because not only did the books seem to be talking to each other, but I felt like a lot of the movie adaptations didn't always emphasize that, or the television shows. And so I thought I was getting something from the books that other people might not have been noticing, especially if they hadn't read them since they were a kid or something.
Now, your formal degree is in? It's
I'm in English. I have a PhD in English from Drew University. I have a bunch of mini specializations, but I guess I'm a romanticist. I like American and British romanticism, and a lot of that's focused on, the 19th century novels. But I also do comic book studies and film studies, and I've been a journalist, so I dabble in a lot.
All right, so tell me about the focus of this book, then, the theme.
Okay. I was seeing these connections as I was reading the books, but I didn't know exactly what they meant, and that's how I work. I notice it and I know it's important and I don't know why. So then I do research and I look into the lives of the authors and I try to figure out if they've read each other. I try to figure out if there's a conscious plan, and in some cases the authors were writing very consciously about environmentalism, deforestation, like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, very much so. Octavia Butler, very much deliberate commentary on climate change. Philip Pullman, it seemed pretty deliberate to me because he's got the polar bears and all the ice melting and they're homeless. But he says it was an accident, which I couldn't believe. And then there's George GRR Martin, who, when he's first asked about climate change, he said, when I went to college, it was pretty cold one winter, and I always remembered that, But over time, he's come to embrace that interpretation, and he likes it because he sees it as making the books more relevant. So I liked looking at author intention, and then I said, okay, well, now what's what do I make of this? So, because I knew fans would be mad at me if they thought I was just riffing on it. Mm-hmm. So I had to include, some actual facts and research, and then I gave my thematic take.
Mm-hmm. How many different authors or series do you look at in this book?
It seems like a hodgepodge, but it's a long book, and the book kept growing. It felt like, Tolkien saying the tale told in the telling. Mm-hmm. I knew I was going to do Game of Thrones and Narnia, and I actually knew Doctor Who would be part of it because there was very conscious series of episodes in comic strips spelling out to fans how much Doctor Who took from the Inklings. Mm-hmm. And then as I was writing it, I saw Mad Max Fury Road, Snowpiercer, 2012. I read The Hunger Games, and there was climate change in it that wasn't in the movies. So I just kept finding new text, and then the trick was to keep it a manageable list of things so that I wouldn't just do everything trivially. Mm-hmm. But I'm really happy. It winds up being a greatest hits of what's popular now because I cover Star Trek and Star Wars, mm-hmm. But just kind of look at it very specifically with ecology.
So it says climate fiction, though, but it sounds like you go into TV and movies as well?
Yeah, that's the trick. Where do you draw your boundaries? One of the things that I find boring about college courses is the extent to which they're bound by, we're just discussing British literature, we're just discussing American, we're confining it to the 18th century. Mm-hmm. And I hate stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so then it's like, well, what am I going to do? I didn't want to just do books because then you just get English majors. And I didn't want to just do pop culture. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was richer, if I did both, and then it's just justify it. And I think anything that riffs on themes that are important to Tolkien and Lewis on religion and ecology and how fascism versus a kind of Christian stewardship of the earth plays out, in allegorical ways in their books, and how people pick that up who work in fantasy and science fiction, whether or not they're Christian like those guys, mm-hmm. they still pick up those threads.
So now, how would you what's the ratio, would you say, where the antagonist in these different pieces are the source of problems with the climate versus where climate change is simply just a big danger presented in the piece?
Let's see. I think you'll have characters in Lord of the Rings who are actively cutting trees down and actively polluting, mm-hmm. and they're doing it in the name of the devil, mm-hmm. because the more the earth is polluted, the less hold God and the angels have over it. Mm-hmm. So pollution winds up being almost like a theological weapon. Hmm. And so they're causing it. And in Philip Pullman, the bad guys are causing it. Then you'll have characters who are just not that powerful, who are villains, mm-hmm. like bad guys in the Mad Max films. What they do is they take advantage of climate change mm-hmm. to consolidate political power. Like if they have all the water, that means they get to have all the concubines and all the power, and they get to parcel it out. Mm-hmm.
So, how many of the pieces talk about ways to reverse this, and how many would you say just say, hey, it's dangerous, watch out, do what you need to do to stop this?
Tolkien is pretty obsessed with how, in certain cases, when there's damage to the world, it's permanent. He'll have epic battles between angels and demons where the earth is just marred to the point where it just doesn't look like what God intended to make anymore. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those wastelands that Frodo walks through are the sites of former huge epic battles, from the Silmarillion. Mm-hmm. So he's like, that you can't recover that. But in the Scouring of the Shire, the hobbits dismantle some of the industrial crap that the evil hobbits were building. And there's this idea that with, cleaning the river and cultivating new crops, over time they'll be able to heal it. So there's sort of a bit of both, that some stuff can be reversed and some stuff you have to live with the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Did you get? It doesn't sound like you got into sci-fi terraforming or anything like that, but perhaps you did or thought about it.
I know that there's a canonical list of stuff that you can consider climate fiction, and there's an extent to which people who care about the real world issues have mixed feelings about a lot of these, movies, and especially the mainstream stuff. Mm-hmm. A lot of it has bad reputations. A lot of people make fun of Waterworld. The Day After Tomorrow has its heart in the right place, but the science isn't very good. Mm-hmm. And then you'll get a lot of movies like Kingsman: The Secret Service and Avengers: Infinity War, where you have a sort of an environmentalist terrorist villain. Mm-hmm. And like, well, what do we make of that? I mean, he's talking about the environment, and that's cool, but he's either crazy or ruthless, or, is this a plus for us, getting the word out on this? Mm-hmm. Or is this just demonizing us and making it all seem rather stupid? Mm-hmm. So with the terraforming stuff, like Interstellar has this idea that we can't save the Earth, so we should go somewhere else. And I think a lot of environmental activists will say, well, it's a lot harder to go somewhere else. Who's going to go? 5 people? Are we going to put a dome on Mars? Why don't we just stop putting plastic in the ocean? Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's why I didn't spend too much time on it.
Okay. And you might have touched on this already, but talking about Tolkien and the religious aspect to saving the environment, would you say how common is that? The sort of moral, theological moralism of it versus just, people need this help or to be protected.
I think religion comes into a lot of the texts I've looked at in a way that I didn't quite anticipate. Like, Lewis was inspired to be both a Christian and an environmentalist because of Tolkien. So a lot of the same themes show up in Narnia. Mm-hmm. And, you'd think a writer like Margaret Atwood, who does Mad Adam and The Handmaid's Tale, mm-hmm. would be very hostile to religion. But a lot of her characters are religious liberals. So they'll be quite spiritual, mm-hmm. but they'll sort of merge Christianity with a sort of a earth goddess theology, and they'll say, the fall was not Adam and Eve biting the apple ages ago. The fall is every time we hurt another living being in some way or another, and every day we decide to hurt something, that's the fall, and it can be reversed. So every time I don't expect to see it, I see it, and it's usually pretty overtly expressed in the book, and it just doesn't always make it in the movie. Like, you can kind of tell reading the Hunger Games books that there's this idea that it's an open secret that Suzanne Collins is a religious Catholic, mm-hmm. and it's woven into the book pretty subtly, but I feel like it's there, and you don't really get that from movie adaptations.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other, say, secondary themes or issues in the book that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to mention?
One of the things that I couldn't figure out is why there's so many Nazis in these stories. There's a lot of that symbolism, and some of it I thought was just, the golden age of science fiction's the 60s, and so obviously they're going to fight the last battles, and there's going to be some World War II nostalgia, and Nazis are easy, ready-made villains. They saved Hitler's brain type mm-hmm. bad guys. Yeah. But I actually think that there's some smart commentary there about kind of out-of-control imperial impulses married to sort of a toxic masculinity and like a conquering impulse. Mm-hmm. That if you put that with, completely unrestrained capitalism or insatiable sexual appetite, what you'll get in villains will be like some sort of guy with a harem who's a rich businessman who secretly has swastikas in his closet, who's ordering trees getting cut down, mm-hmm. and, maybe he has an army of robots, so these sort of figures seem to be in almost all of these stories. There's just the science fiction version who's like the space businessman like Cohagen in Total Recall, mm-hmm. or the more fantasy, villain who'll have horns or something. But the idea that the flip side of that would be some sort of St. Francis of Assisi or eco-feminist idea of all life is sacred and God wants us to take care of it and not distinguish between plants and animals, men and women, or rate people by their race or how much money they make. That everybody has a right to life. So it's a sort of a philosophically pro-life, eco-feminist response to the Nazi impulse.
Interesting. So let me ask you about the resources used for your research. The stuff you studied, it's all in pop culture, so you had easy access to that, I assume, to all the materials.
Yeah.
What else did you interview people? Did you what other things did you read or consume to assist?
I think what I needed from the living authors was pretty readily available in newspaper interviews and YouTube videos and NPR interviews. So if the person was still alive and they really explicitly talked about the themes of the book, I very much went to the well with big block quotes. I let them speak for themselves. And I did that also with C.S. Lewis a lot because his Christian theology is kind of odd and he's very misunderstood. I think he's often seen as a super reactionary guy. And there's all these paragraphs that seem pretty hippie coming from a guy who we think of as having male pattern baldness and tweed jackets, So I heavily block quote him also. And it's a risk, because people tend to gloss over block quotes. But I feel like people wouldn't believe me if I just said, C.S. Lewis doesn't think banning birth control is a key element of Christianity, and he doesn't think regulating women's sexuality is that important. He thinks sexuality is okay. And if I just say that, no one would believe me. But if I have 5 block quotes from different books, then suddenly I'm not just going out on a limb. So I like having the authors speak for themselves, But I didn't do any interviews with them in person because all the stuff I needed was already out there. What I did was pull it all together because all this stuff hasn't been compared to each other before that I know of.
So it sounds like so it is about climate fiction, and you do, it sounds like you talk about elements of that, but it seems like you go deeply somewhat into the theology and other aspects of the writing and the fiction.
Yeah. It's a weird combo. It was hard to get published in terms of publishers like to know who they're marketing it to. So they'll say, is this book just for casual fans? Like, is there going to be a lot of photos? Or is this book for serious college professor scholars of literature? Or is this a religious handbook? Or, what is this? Now, it was hard to tell them because I was writing about Tolkien and Lewis, it had to be all those things because people come to those guys for different reasons, and I want to deal with all of it. So there's huge chapters on the theology of the environmentalism. There's a big chapters on the politics. But I do literary criticism and film criticism, and I do fan stuff, and I talk about world building and the canonical history of the fictional Doctor Who universe. So each chapter has like a totally different feel to it and almost feels like it belongs in a different kind of book. But I think the end result is I can interest all kinds of people, and maybe they'll jump around or maybe they'll read the whole thing. But I tried to write for lots of people instead of just a fan audience or an academic audience.
Do you think in the last 10 or 15 years, the audience for academic studies of pop culture has grown? I think it's grown considerably. That's a guess, but what do you think?
I think so because, I've done a couple of expensive studies of directors, and I don't know that people are very excited about directors other than, the Coen brothers maybe or Spielberg. But my superhero studies stuff has sold very well and much better than any normal academic book would sell. I tell professors how much I've sold, and they can't believe it, and that's all down to the fans, I think. And the more affordable presses like McFarland. And I'm glad to see it, and because that's what I do. And I've found a lot of good books on pop culture out there by my colleagues that are really readable. They're not too goofy theory, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're important because the pop culture stuff is a way of talking about issues that really frighten people, and in a way that's a little calming because, you know, I mean, I wrote about this because I'm afraid of climate change, but, you know, thinking about it with Bilbo is a little easier than thinking about it without Bilbo.
Yeah.
So, you know, I feel the same way. You know, it's easier to talk about the Patriot Act using Marvel Civil War than just using arguments made by, you know, the Secretary of State or Michael Moore. You know, that's much more fraught than Captain America and Iron Man.
Yeah. What in the research? What part of the research was most enjoyable?
I think there were a couple of stages where I got stuck, and that was no good. But I really enjoyed writing it as a whole, because I like not knowing what I'm writing about, even 200 pages in, because I'll start a project knowing there's something there, and I just follow it, and I enjoy trying to figure out what I'm writing. And I was lucky; I had a couple of friends. One who was a big Tolkien fan, one who's a religious studies scholar. One who's an ecologist, and I'd show them it as it's going along. I said, do you know where this is going? And they'd give me some tips. Or I sort of group wrote it on Facebook, where my friends will say, I found a source. You'd bet you didn't know this was true about Tolkien. And up until the very last minute, I was still finding out great stuff. Like, I didn't know Tolkien wrote a short story about what it's like to be an Inkling that made fun of all the other guys. It's like, oh, that's really important to what I'm saying. Where is that? And it's in, you know, volume 9 of these fragments that his son has been publishing, and I never would have found that if my friends hadn't helped. So just the fact that up until the page proofs, I'm sneaking in references to The Last Jedi and, you know, Infinity War at the last second, and, you know, laughing to myself that people are going to wonder how I got the book so up to date when it's a book. You know, that just made me giddy.
Yeah, that's cool. So you mentioned being surprised by all the Nazi characters you came across. Was there anything else in your research that surprised you?
Well, let's see. I think I just kept being surprised by how much books written so long ago seemed so relevant now, and how much Tolkien and Lewis saw coming, especially since people tend to think of them as people that look to the past, you know, purely nostalgic thinkers. To have them seem more like prophets seemed odd to me. But you know, I read a discussion of how corporate forces could take over colleges and fire teachers and defang curriculum and just make it about job training based on market values of majors. And this was in Lewis's 1945, That Hideous Strength. And it's very much describing what's going on with colleges now. So, you know, something like that's pretty odd. And I'd noticed that, and I'd also noticed, hey, you know, this is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. That's interesting. So I would notice all those things at once, and I would just keep being surprised. And the extent to which I think I'm taking a break from the book, and I'll try reading something for fun, and it would wind up being related to the book, and it was really weird.
Yeah, it's that the messages are hidden in everything, all pop culture.
And it's important to me. You know, I have friends who don't like the escapist stuff I like. They'll say, "Oh, you're dumb action movies and your dumb comic books," and I'll say, you know, this is deeper than you think. And actually, I would argue one of the reasons I came up with the idea for the book was my wife accused me of watching the HBO Game of Thrones just for the breasts. And I was like, no, there's more going on here, and there's more than just Tyrion being funny. You know, what is it? You know, and so that was the beginning of this process. To defend myself from the sexposition scenes and their impression on my wife. But, you know, an accusation I get is, you know, you're elevating this material because you're smarter than it, and you're seeing stuff in it that's not there. And what was nice as I did this was the extent to which I was able to build a case that, no, it's there, you know, and now I can comment on it. You know, it's not, I just have to make this stuff up.
Lowbrow can't ever get any respect, I guess.
Yeah.
You can't even call it lowbrow, but whatever the term would be for pop culture.
Well, and I think the trick is my grandfather just loved nonfiction. He just loved science books. And he said that fiction's just fundamentally useless. It doesn't matter how serious the subject matter is. Mm-hmm. And there's a great literary essay by Flannery O'Connor, and she says, only cowards refuse to read fiction because fiction's a direct plunge into the heart. And you think you're running from reality with fiction, but you're running right into everything. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with Tolkien and Lewis. On the one hand, you like elves. Like, I can't even relate to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, at least superheroes are in New York. Right? I mean, but at the same time, they want to forget that all their friends died in World War I, and they want to forget that their parents died young, and they want to forget that all the trees in their childhood neighborhood are getting cut down, and yet they're writing books in a fictional reality with elves in which trees are getting cut down and people get butchered by invading armies. Mm-hmm. So that's their escapism. It seems like they're running right to the trench warfare. Mm-hmm. And if you on the surface, it just seems like a bunch of elves, but if you really pay any attention at all, man, that's like Wilfred Owen World War I poetry. Mm-hmm. It's right in there.
Yeah. So, what was the most difficult point to research? Either a question you still don't feel you have a solid answer on, or something that just took the longest to reach a conclusion on?
I'm embarrassed by this, but when I was an undergrad, I studied medieval studies as a minor because I wanted to understand my Catholicism, and I really liked the weirdo astronomy they did before they understood what the solar system was really like. So these strange medieval texts like the Cosmographia of Bernardus Sylvestris, and I can't even believe I studied that stuff, but it was fun for me. Mm-hmm. And my friend at the time said, Tolkien loved all that, and he did his own riff on it, and he wrote the Silmarillion. You're gonna love it. And in theory, I should, but I actually find it harder to read than the original medieval texts. And I'm frustrated. Like I wish I found it easier to read because actually the plots really speak to me. Mm-hmm. But the hardest part of the book to me was I would have to go to my friend Bill, who's been reading Tolkien since he was about 7, mm-hmm. to translate some of the stuff on the Silmarillion for me. So like, well, who's the Maiar? Who's in charge of the water, and who's in charge of the air, and when did this battle happen? And he would have to. So I really relied on him for those parts of the book. But it was fun because it was an excuse to talk to my old friend. Mm-hmm. But that's where I feel dumb during those segments. Mm-hmm. Okay. And not like the poser Tolkien guy. But I feel completely confident in everything else. But if I'm ever asked about his, I think the specifics of his universe, that draw a map of Middle Earth, I'd be like, I'll get my friend Bill. Yeah. But the morals, the basic themes, how he defines heroism, I'm very comfortable talking about that.
Yeah, the deep history is kind of hard to get a hold of. Well,
if somebody wants to destroy me by trying to get me to speak Elvish or something, they're wide open. They could do that.
Was there anything you discovered in your research that emotionally moved you in any way, either negatively or positively?
Honestly, the whole thing, because I don't know. When I was a kid, I would go out into nature. Anyway, I guess it was just overgrown parts of Staten Island. My dad would show me praying mantises and monarch butterflies, and we'd look at lightning bugs in the evening, and a lot of cheap housing would go up, and they'd cut all that away and get rid of it, and I felt bad because we were the benefit of that cheap housing. We were Italian immigrants who had enough money to buy our own house, and we moved into Staten Island, and my relatives make lots of money putting up houses in New Jersey, and so I benefited from it, but I also missed the fireflies and the praying mantises and the butterflies. So it's something that is really central to me, and I've run from it my whole life. I've been scared of it my whole life. So this was therapy, and everything I read help me either mourn or have hope or just manage the fear. And so, especially since the authors, the other thing that's kind of neat about it, they have different religions, different political parties, might not even like each other. Like Gnostics, Christian, like a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, Jewish, and they just all seem like decent people, you know, and I kind of get the sense that, like, if I made a think tank for helping the environment and put them all on it, that they actually might get along. And that was sort of inspiring to me, too, the idea that, you know, at least we all want clean drinking water, and, you know, there's certain things we can get together on, in theory, you know. And I think that's what Game of Thrones is about, actually, in the end, this idea that there are some things that are bigger than the Starks and the Lannisters, and a few of them will never let go of their rage, but a lot of them will if the stakes get high enough.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, yeah.
Which is funny, because it seems like, in the end, quite a hopeful moral for something that has so much butchery and rape. It feels like the end moral with the bow on it is a Captain Kirk speech about making peace with the Klingons.
Yeah. Something to chew on. What do you hope the book will do?
In a way, one of my target audiences is people who have a pretty stereotypical view of Tolkien and Lewis, to try to expand that, and to try to get religious Christians who have been kind of weirdly on the side of the oil industry and pro-pollution to kind of rethink that, because these guys really say, no, only a Satanist would be pro-pollution. It's a preposterous notion. Don't be with Sauron. So I think I can, I mean, I'm not trying to fool anybody, but one of the things that's interesting about the books I write is I tend to focus on the National Review canon of literature, like the Jane Austen, superheroes, the Inklings. But I always kind of say, you know, there's a subversive quality of these texts, and what I find is some of the people who read my stuff say, all right, I don't agree with the word you say, but you've done your research and you're interesting and you seem nice, but, you know, don't come over my house. Or people say, oh, it's pretty balanced, or people say, oh, this is biased crap and I hate every page. And, you know, and I've gotten that sort of gamut of reviews. So I guess I am trying to get people to broaden their definition of Christianity, and I'm trying to get people who look at pop culture to see more in it that I see, to train them to be better readers of pop culture, and they can, okay, I've focused on ecology, and maybe they want to focus on gender or race or anything they're interested in. I've modeled that, and, you know, my Game of Thrones is not necessarily somebody else's. And I guess the last thing would be, you know, maybe raising some environmental awareness. So I had a bunch of goals there, I guess.
Okay.
But I wrote it to defeat my own demons, and what's been nice is that people who've read it say, you know, this is clearly your stealth autobiography, and only you could have written this, but it speaks to me anyway. And it's been kind of nice.
That's cool, yeah. Can you speak to any difficulties you had in finishing the book or getting it published, and how you overcame those?
Oh, it was hard to get published. I was in a religion conference in Texas, and I spoke to Baylor University, and just part of me wanted to put it out with a pretty conservative religious press, and they thought it was too edgy, and it wasn't pure religious studies enough. And, you know, I would try it with a literary publisher, and they'd say, well, there's too much film and comic book and TV in it. Or I'll go to a pop culture publisher, and they'll say there's too much literary studies in it. I had one who was initially really interested. They just loved the marketability of everybody I had. Like, this is great. But when I handed it in, where our deal fell apart was, it was very important to me to say, okay, who are the bad guys in Snowpiercer? Who are the bad guys in The Strain and Total Recall and Mad Max? Well, let's identify them in the news. And I started to actually identify them. and they were like, "Oh, this is way too edgy. We thought this was going to be a cute book about Lord of the Rings, and this is really offensive, you know." And so I thought about it, and I said, "Well, am I just some activist, and am I, you know, disguising myself as a reasonable college teacher or sci-fi geek, and I'm just a nut, or are they just timid and censoring me?" And I just thought about it. There's so many fan books about Tolkien. Like, what makes this different? Like, my take on the way they think and the way I connect them to more modern texts. That's what. So to take all the contemporary stuff out is to kind of defang the book and ruin the point of it. So I stuck to my guns. Mm-hmm. I just toned it down a little without sacrificing the content. You know, I pulled out a few rants, you know. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad they made me tone it down, and I'm glad they made me put in some more traditional sources. Mm-hmm. But in the end, I'm glad I stuck to my guns, and I had to go to a different publisher because they said, "Yeah, you're not changing this enough." Mm-hmm. And SUNY is in New York, and they got a hippie edge, so they're like, "Yeah, do what you want to do." And I got to put out a book that was more rigorous thanks to the first publisher I dealt with. Mm-hmm. It's still my book thanks to the one that actually printed it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. That's a cool story.
Yeah, it was hard. There was a moment there when I didn't have a publisher, and I was like, "Why? Am I just being stubborn? You know, is this now just going to be in my desk?" But it was important enough to me. I didn't want it to. They wanted the length halved, no pictures. But now I've got a nice huge book with 45 pictures, so I'm pretty pumped.
That's pretty
cool. Came out pretty.
So, what's your next writing project?
Well, I wrote an intro to an anthology on working class comic book heroes, and it's got essays by friends of mine about, you know, Walking Dead and V for Vendetta, and there's also coverage of all the Netflix superheroes. They'll get their own essay, like Luke Cage and Jessica Jones. I snuck the Thing in there because he was my favorite when I was a kid. So that just came out, and I'm excited about that. I think that'll get. I really feel like one book on ecology and one on class warfare. I got my finger on the pulse here. Mm-hmm. So I think I've been toying with doing horror movies and Me Too, so I get the gamut of everything going on now. Because there's so many interesting horror movies where a director will basically do an allegory for their terrible marriage, only put a werewolf in it or something. Mm-hmm. And they'll say in the commentary track, "Yeah, this happened to me. This is my wife. I made her a werewolf." And it's happened on enough commentaries of these Scream Factory Blu-rays I've been watching. I'm like, well, what does this mean? You know, especially with Me Too going on. You know, if The Brood is autobiographical and Brian De Palma's movies are autobiographical, and it's beginning to look like Tarantino's Death Proof is his confession for what he did to Uma Thurman. Yeah. What's that all about? You know. Yeah. And there's a director who accidentally killed 2 children and an actor making Twilight Zone the movie, mm-hmm. and he seemed to do some sort of confession piece in Masters of Horror, Dear Woman. So I think, what do these confessions mean, especially if the statements of the press and on trial were it wasn't my fault, but the movie they made after seemed to be, yes, it was. What does all that mean, and how do I supposed to feel about it as a fan of their work? You know, I don't want to be too quick to forgive them. I don't want to see them never work again. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to feel about it, and that's always how I come up with an idea for a story or book. If I don't know how I feel about something, I write it to figure it out, and it's just important enough to me that I think I'll do it sometime in the future, but it's not keeping me up at night, so I'm not really that worried about how I feel about Tarantino. Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, but it's something that interests me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to explore. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like, does Louis C.K. never work again, or has he come back too soon, or can he come back in 5 years? Mm-hmm. And am I only interested in when his comeback is because I'm a dude? Mm-hmm. You know, so these are, I don't know. I'm very into ethics, and, you know, I probably should calm down about it.
Well, I mean, it says a lot. You know, it doesn't just say something about the creators. It says something about the people their audience. You know, their feelings and their their own ethics, what they accept, what they think they accept, if they're fooling themselves or not.
Yeah. Well, and horror is, I guess when I was a kid, I liked horror because I liked the romanticism of it. It's in Germany in 17th century, and Dracula can command wolves, and he can live forever, and he has wine and a harem. I like the stuff that wasn't actually scary. And then there's the endurance tests. Can you handle watching the slasher movie? It's the most violent one ever, and prove you're tough. And then I realized I kind of liked these confessional ones where people had a tragedy in their lives and they're sneaking that into the movie. Mm-hmm. I was like, well, this is more deep than usual. This is more deep than, can I make a movie that's scarier than Evil Dead? Mm-hmm. Like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
Because, like, what's horror for, Because that's another thing, people I care about will walk by and I'm watching horror and they go, why are you watching this for fun? This is not fun, Mm-hmm. And then I ask myself, well, why am I watching Hellraiser 1? It ain't Bambi, so.
Or that show Evil versus, or Ash versus the Evil Dead, I think.
Yeah.
Which is, it's just crazy.
I saw a season of it and I was really enjoying it, and there was some wild stuff about his racism. Like he's a racist guy with Hispanic friends, and I was like, this is interesting. Yeah. But it was so violent. Like, I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is a bit much.
But what else would you expect from that franchise, so to speak?
Yeah. And the first one, it took me years to watch because I was scared. And when I saw it, I was like, yeah, this is... I believe everything in horror movies. I have friends that be like, oh, I could tell that's fake. And, no, I trick myself because that's the way I enjoy stuff. And so I scare the crap out of myself watching the Blair Witch Project in the basement with the lights off. I'm not the sort of person that goes, that wouldn't happen in real life. I can see the wires. No, I want the movie to work. But then why? Why do I want...
Yeah. Yeah, I think I am too. I really get into it and take it for what it is.
Yeah, like I'll say, okay, yeah, this character should have gone to the bathroom by now. Like Jack Bauer should have gone to the bathroom. Well, he probably went in a commercial. Like, I don't need to find an error, Mm-hmm. I'll just go with it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I don't know that Bauer could go to Mexico and come back in less than 24 hours and save the world. That's a little much.
Now they're stretching it, yeah.
Yeah. I can't go to and from Oklahoma City from Weatherford in 70 miles in a day,
Yeah. So where can people find the book and any other writing you do, say on social media accounts or anything like that?
Well, here's the deal. This is a good book, but if you look it up now, it'll be a hardcover for $95, and you're going to be like, yeah, I'm never going to read that. But the publisher thinks it's going to be big, I think. So they're going to put out a softcover pretty soon, in a few months. So maybe just be a little patient, and right around January, there should be an affordable $30-ish version. And I put my soul into this, so I'll guarantee you, if you're interested in any of those topics, you should get something out of it, even if I'm a little quirky for you. I'm pretty proud of War, Politics, and Superheroes. That's even more fanish and less academic than this. That's already out. That's like in the $30 range. And that's just like the war on terror and superhero movies, and the original Civil War is a centerpiece. Mm-hmm. I'm proud of that. So if you look me up on Amazon, they have all my books. And I've done some religious studies stuff on, being Catholic or different ways of reading the Gospels. And I've done some movie criticism, and so it's kind of a variety of stuff out there, But yeah, it's all there on Amazon, and I'd love to see some of the stuff get in a regular bookstore, but it's just academic enough. Maybe a place in the Village or some boutique comic book stores I've seen my stuff in.
And social media accounts, you don't have platforms?
I tried it for a while, but I wound up getting into big fights with people over Anita Sarkeesian, so I decided to not do it anymore.
Okay. All right.
But I don't know. Maybe I should try it again. I feel like I'm very reasonable and easy to talk to until I'm on social media, and then I get dumb and angry.
Yeah. It's yep. I know what you're saying.
I think you can only really talk about politics and religion with somebody that you love and trust who think slightly different than you, and maybe in 7 years they can nudge you. But this whole yelling at somebody you've never met, I just hate fighting with a friend of a friend or a relative of a friend I've never met in person on Facebook.
Yeah, that is awkward.
And it goes on a whole day. You know, if I could just talk about how cool I think Tom Baker is on Twitter, you know, then I would totally have a Twitter account. But, you know. Yeah. It won't take long before people ask me what I think of Jodie Whittaker, and then suddenly it's going to get pretty hairy pretty fast.
So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and thanks for contacting me. And you know, I've worked on this 5 years, so just thanks for listening, and to everybody who's listening, thank you. All
right. Well, thank you. Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.